Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the frosted window of the remote research station, watching the snow fall in thick, heavy sheets across the Alaskan wilderness. The weather forecast had been wrong again. What started as a light snowfall 3 hours ago had turned into something much more dangerous. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the small building's metal frame. "Another cup of coffee?" asked Marcus, her research partner, holding up the steaming pot. His voice carried a note of concern that matched her own growing worry. "Thanks," Sarah said, accepting the warm mug gratefully. "How long do you think this storm will last?" Marcus checked his phone for the 100th time that morning. No signal still. The weather radio died an hour ago. "We're flying blind here." Sarah nodded, trying to push down the anxiety building in her chest. They had come to this isolated station to study climate patterns in the Arctic, but nature seemed determined to make them part of the study instead. The station sat 50 miles from the nearest town, connected only by a single dirt road that was probably already impassable. A soft scratching sound caught her attention. Sarah looked down to see a small white shape moving near her feet. Snow, the albino ferret she had rescued 3 months ago, was looking up at her with his pink eyes. The little animal had appeared at the research station during her first week, clearly abandoned and nearly frozen. Despite regulations about keeping animals at the facility, Sarah couldn't leave him to die in the harsh wilderness. "Hey there, buddy," she whispered, reaching down to gently stroke his white fur. Snow responded by climbing up her arm and settling on her shoulder, his favorite perch. The ferret had become her constant companion, following her everywhere around the small station. Marcus watched them with a smile. "That little guy really loves you. Never seen anything like it." Sarah felt Snow's tiny claws grip her sweater as another gust of wind shook the building. "He's special. Albino animals often don't survive long in the wild. Too visible to predators, sensitive to sunlight. But Snow here is different. Tougher than he looks." The power flickered, causing both researchers to glance nervously at the lights. Their generator was reliable, but storms like this could push any equipment to its limits. Sarah had experienced bad weather before during her years as a climate researcher, but something about this storm felt different. More intense. More dangerous. "We should check our emergency supplies," Marcus suggested, already moving toward the storage closet. "Food, water, medical kit, extra batteries." Sarah agreed, following him with Snow still perched on her shoulder. The little ferret seemed to sense the tension in the air. His normally playful demeanor had turned alert and watchful. As they inventoried their supplies, Sarah noticed Snow's nose twitching constantly, as if he was picking up scents that worried him. Their emergency supplies looked adequate for a few days, but Sarah hoped they wouldn't need them that long. The research station was well built but not designed for extreme weather events. It was meant for temporary stays during the mild summer months, not for surviving winter storms that could last for days. The wind outside grew stronger, and Sarah could hear debris hitting the walls. Through the window, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The world beyond the glass looked like a white void, empty and threatening. She had seen storms before, but this one felt like nature unleashing its full fury. Snow suddenly jumped down from her shoulder and ran to the door, scratching at it urgently. His behavior was unusual. The ferret was normally content to stay warm inside, especially during bad weather. "What's wrong with him?" Marcus asked, noticing Snow's agitated state. Sarah knelt beside the small animal, studying his behavior. "I don't know. He seems anxious about something outside." As if responding to her words, Snow ran to the window and stood on his hind legs, pressing his tiny paws against the glass. His pink eyes stared intently into the storm, and he made small chittering sounds that Sarah had never heard before. "Maybe he senses something we don't," she said thoughtfully. "Animals often detect changes in weather patterns before humans do. Their senses are much sharper than ours." Marcus checked the weather monitoring equipment they had brought for their research. Barometric pressure is still dropping. Temperatures down to -20 and falling fast. This storm isn't done with us yet. Sarah picked up Snow, feeling how tense his small body had become. It's okay, little guy. We're safe inside. But, even as she said the words, she wasn't entirely sure she believed them. The storm seemed to be intensifying rather than moving through the area. The building creaked and groaned under the assault of wind and snow. Ice was forming on the inside of the windows despite the heater running at full capacity. The lights flickered again, staying off for several long seconds before coming back on. In that moment of darkness, Sarah felt Snow's claws dig deeper into her sweater. The little animal was genuinely frightened, and his fear was starting to affect her too. We should probably stay away from the windows, Marcus suggested. If this wind gets much stronger, we could have problems with flying debris. They moved to the center of the main room, where Sarah set up a comfortable area with blankets and pillows. Snow immediately curled up in her lap, but his eyes remained fixed on the door. Every few minutes, he would lift his head and sniff the air, as if tracking something invisible. Hours passed slowly. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The temperature inside the station was dropping despite the heater working overtime. Sarah could see her breath forming small clouds in the increasingly cold air. The heating system is struggling, Marcus observed, adjusting the thermostat again. This cold is beyond what it was designed to handle. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter and tucked Snow inside for extra warmth. The little ferret seemed grateful for the additional heat, snuggling closer to her body. She could feel his heart beating rapidly against her chest, a tiny drum of anxiety. As night approached, the storm reached a new level of intensity. The wind sounded like a freight train passing overhead. Snow had been restless for hours, occasionally jumping down to pace near the door before returning to Sarah's lap. His behavior was becoming more concerning. I think we should try to get some sleep, Marcus said, though his voice suggested he didn't think sleep would come easily. Take turns keeping watch, just in case. Sarah nodded, arranging the blankets into makeshift beds. Snow refused to leave her side, staying curled against her even as she lay down. The little animal's warmth was comforting, but his continued alertness kept her on edge. The power went out completely around midnight. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie shadows around the small space. The sudden quiet from the heater made the storm outside sound even more violent. Sarah could hear Marcus moving around in the darkness, probably checking their backup power systems. Generators working, he whispered. But the main power line must be down. We're running on limited battery backup now. Snow suddenly sat up in Sarah's arms, his body rigid with attention. He made a low growling sound that seemed impossible for such a small animal. Sarah had never heard him make that noise before. What is it, Snow? She whispered, sitting up as well. The ferret jumped down and ran to the door again, this time scratching more urgently than before. His behavior was almost frantic, as if he was trying to tell them something important. Marcus appeared beside them with a flashlight. What's got him so worked up? Sarah shook her head, watching Snow's increasingly desperate attempts to get their attention. The little animal ran back and forth between the door and the window, chittering loudly despite the danger outside. I think he's trying to warn us about something, Sarah said slowly. But what? Her question was answered by a loud cracking sound from above. All three of them, including Snow, looked up at the ceiling. The sound came again, like wood splitting under immense pressure. The roof, Marcus said grimly. The weight of the snow and ice is getting to be too much. Sarah scooped up Snow, who seemed relieved that they were finally understanding his warnings. The little ferret had been trying to alert them to the structural danger all along. His sensitive hearing had picked up the subtle sounds of the building beginning to fail under the storm's assault. Another crack echoed through the station, this one louder and more ominous. Chunks of ice fell from the ceiling, scattered around the room. The building was reaching its breaking point. We need to get to the strongest part of the structure, Marcus said, grabbing their emergency supplies. The storage room has reinforced walls. Sarah clutched Snow tightly as they gathered their essential items. The ferret remained calm now that they were taking action, as if he understood that his warnings had been heard. His trust in her was absolute, even as their situation became increasingly dangerous. The storage room was small and cramped, but its concrete walls offered better protection than the main area. They arranged their supplies and settled in for what could be a long wait. Snow immediately positioned himself where he could watch both the door and his human companions. "Good boy," Sarah murmured, stroking his white fur. "You probably saved our lives." Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. But, inside their improvised shelter, surrounded by supplies and warmed by their shared body heat, they felt a small measure of security. Snow had given them the warning they needed to survive the night. The little albino ferret curled up in Sarah's lap once more, finally, allowing himself to rest. His job as their early warning system was done, but Sarah knew he would remain alert throughout the night. Snow had appointed himself as their guardian, and he took that responsibility seriously. As the hours passed and the storm raged on, Sarah realized that their survival might depend entirely on the instincts and loyalty of one small white animal who refused to abandon the human who had saved his life. Snow had chosen to stay with them when he could have found shelter elsewhere. Now it was their turn to trust in his warnings and hope that together, they could all make it through the nightmare outside. Dawn brought no relief from the storm's fury. Sarah woke to find Snow sitting alertly beside her, his pink eyes focused on something beyond the storage room door. The little ferret hadn't moved from his protective position all night, standing guard while she and Marcus slept in shifts. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the concrete walls. Sarah could hear the wind still howling outside, but there were new sounds now. Creaking. Groaning. The occasional crash of something heavy hitting the ground outside their shelter. "How long do you think we've been in here?" Marcus asked quietly, checking his watch. The display showed 7 in the morning, but the perpetual darkness of the storm made time feel meaningless. "About 6 hours," Sarah replied, gently stroking Snow's fur. The ferret leaned into her touch but never took his eyes off the door. "Snow's been awake the whole time. I think he's still worried about something." Marcus tried his phone again, hoping for any kind of signal. Nothing. They were completely cut off from the outside world. The weather radio remained dead, and their satellite equipment had likely been damaged by flying debris. Snow suddenly stood and walked to the door, pressing his ear against the metal. His tiny body tensed, and he made a soft chirping sound that Sarah had learned meant danger. The ferret's hearing was far superior to theirs. Whatever he was detecting, it wasn't good news. "We should check the main room," Sarah said, standing carefully. Her muscles were stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. "Maybe the storm has passed." But when Marcus carefully opened the storage room door, they were met with a blast of frigid air. The main room was destroyed. The roof had partially collapsed during the night, leaving twisted metal beams and chunks of insulation scattered everywhere. Snow covered half the floor, blown in through the gaping hole above. "My God," Marcus whispered, staring at the destruction. "If we had stayed out there." Sarah picked up Snow, who was shivering in the cold air rushing through the building. "You saved us," she told the little animal. "You knew this would happen." The ferret nuzzled against her neck, seeking warmth. The temperature in the main room had dropped to well below freezing. Their heater lay crushed under a fallen beam, and snow continued to blow in through the collapsed sections of roof. "We can't stay here," Marcus said, surveying the damage. "The rest of the roof could come down at any time." Sarah looked at their limited supplies. They had enough food and water for maybe 2 days if they were careful. But, without shelter, they wouldn't survive the storm for 2 hours, let alone 2 days. The nearest town was 50 miles away through wilderness that was currently buried under feet of snow. Snow jumped down from her arms and began exploring the edges of the destroyed room. He moved carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The ferret seemed to understand that the floor might not be stable. "What's he doing?" Marcus asked, watching Snow's methodical investigation. "I think he's looking for a safe way out," Sarah said. "Animals have better instincts for navigating dangerous terrain." Snow paused near what had been the back wall of the station. A large section of the wall had buckled inward, but it had created a gap that led to the outside. The ferret sniffed at the opening, then looked back at Sarah with an expression that seemed almost intelligent. "He's found something," she said, moving carefully across the debris-covered floor to where Snow waited. Peering through the gap, Sarah could see that the collapsed wall had created a partial windbreak. Large chunks of debris had formed a natural shelter against the storm's full force. Snow had found them a way to escape the building before it collapsed completely. "Smart little guy," Marcus said admiringly. "But where can we go? We're in the middle of nowhere." Snow seemed to have an answer to that question too. He squeezed through the gap and stood in the sheltered area outside, looking back at them expectantly. When they didn't immediately follow, he ran a few steps in a specific direction, then returned to wait for them. "He wants us to follow him," Sarah realized. "But where could he be leading us?" Marcus gathered their emergency supplies while Sarah bundled up in her heaviest winter gear. The temperature outside was brutal, easily 30 below zero with the wind chill. They would need to move quickly to avoid frostbite. Snow waited patiently as they squeezed through the gap one by one. Once they were all outside, the ferret immediately began moving in a straight line away from the collapsed research station. He moved with purpose, as if he knew exactly where he was going. The storm was still raging, but the debris from the building provided some protection from the worst of the wind. Sarah could barely see 5 feet in any direction through the blowing snow. Without Snow leading the way, they would have been lost immediately. "How does he know where he's going?" Marcus shouted over the wind. Sarah didn't have an answer, but she trusted the little animal completely. Snow had already saved their lives once. She had to believe he could do it again. They followed the ferret through the white maze of the storm. Snow moved with confidence, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or check that his human companions were still behind him. The little animal seemed unaffected by the cold that was already numbing Sarah's face despite her protective gear. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Snow led them to a cluster of large rocks that formed a natural windbreak. But, more importantly, there was an opening between the rocks that led to what appeared to be a small cave. Snow disappeared into the opening and emerged a moment later, chittering excitedly. He had found them real shelter. A place where they could wait out the storm safely. The cave was small but dry, carved out of solid rock that would protect them from both wind and collapse. Snow had somehow known about this refuge and had guided them directly to it through the blinding storm. It was impossible, but it had happened. "This is incredible," Marcus said, setting down their supplies and examining the cave. "It's like he had a map in his head." Sarah sat down on the cave floor and pulled Snow into her lap. The ferret was breathing heavily from their journey through the snow, but his eyes were bright with satisfaction. He had completed his mission successfully. "How did you know about this place?" she asked him softly. Snow just looked up at her with those remarkable pink eyes, as if the answer should be obvious. As they settled into their new shelter, Sarah began to piece together what might have happened. Snow had been living in this area for months before she found him. During that time, he would have explored every inch of the surrounding territory, learning about every possible hiding place and shelter. When the storm hit, the ferret's survival instincts had kicked in. He knew the research station wasn't safe, but he also knew where they could find real protection. Snow had been trying to lead them to safety from the very beginning, but they hadn't understood his urgency until it was almost too late. The cave was warmer than the outside air, though still quite cold. They arranged their sleeping bags and emergency supplies, creating a small camp that would keep them alive until the storm passed. Snow explored every corner of their new home, making sure it was truly safe. "We owe our lives to him," Sarah said, watching the little ferret complete his security check. "Without Snow, we never would have found this place." Marcus nodded, arranging their food supplies. "I've never seen anything like it. It's like he planned this whole rescue operation." As if understanding that he was being discussed, Snow returned to Sarah's side and curled up in her lap. The ferret finally allowed himself to relax, confident that his humans were now truly safe. His mission was complete. Outside, the storm continued to rage with undiminished fury. But, inside their rocky shelter, they were protected from its violence. They had warmth, supplies, and, most importantly, they had Snow's unwavering loyalty and intelligence guiding them. Sarah realized that the albino ferret who had refused to leave her behind had now saved her life twice. First by warning them about the collapsing roof, and, then, by leading them to safety through the storm. Snow's determination to protect his human family had overcome every obstacle nature could throw at them. The little white animal slept peacefully in her lap, finally, at rest after hours of vigilant protection. Sarah stroked his fur gently, marveling at the courage and intelligence contained in such a small package. Snow had proven that size didn't matter when love and loyalty were involved. As the wind howled outside their shelter, Sarah knew they would survive the storm. They had found safety, and they had each other. Most importantly, they had Snow, the remarkable albino ferret who refused to abandon the humans who had given him a home. The nightmare was far from over, but they were no longer helpless victims of the storm. Thanks to Snow's guidance, they had become survivors, working together to overcome whatever challenges the wilderness might throw at them next. The little ferret had shown them that sometimes salvation comes in the smallest packages, carried by the biggest hearts. The storm raged for 3 more days. Sarah lost track of time in the darkness of their rocky shelter, measuring the hours only by Snow's regular patrols to the cave entrance. The little ferret had appointed himself their sentinel, checking every few hours for changes in the weather outside. Their food supplies were running dangerously low. Marcus had rationed their emergency rations carefully, but they had only packed enough for a short research trip, not an extended survival situation. Water wasn't a problem since they could melt snow, but Sarah worried about their caloric needs in the extreme cold. Snow seemed to sense their growing concern. The ferret had become increasingly restless, making short trips outside the cave and returning with an agitated energy that Sarah had learned to recognize. Something was troubling him, but she couldn't figure out what. "He's been acting strange all morning," she told Marcus, watching Snow pace near the cave entrance. "More anxious than usual." Marcus looked up from checking their remaining supplies. "Maybe he can tell the storm is finally breaking." Animals are supposed to be sensitive to weather changes. But Snow's behavior didn't suggest relief. If anything, the ferret seemed more worried than ever. He kept running to the entrance, sticking his head out into the blowing snow, then returning to Sarah with an urgency that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "What is it, buddy?" she asked, picking up the small animal. Snow squirmed in her arms, clearly wanting to show her something outside. "You want me to go out there with you?" The idea seemed insane. The storm was still howling with deadly intensity. But Snow had never led them wrong before. His instincts had saved their lives multiple times already. Maybe she needed to trust him again. "I'm going to take a look outside," she told Marcus, pulling on her heavy winter gear. "Are you crazy? It's a blizzard out there." Sarah secured Snow inside her jacket, feeling the ferret's small body trembling with excitement. "Snow's trying to tell us something important. He hasn't been wrong yet." The wind nearly knocked her down as she stepped outside the cave. Snow immediately began squirming inside her jacket, trying to direct her attention to something she couldn't see through the blowing snow. The ferret's urgency was contagious. Something was definitely wrong. Following Snow's insistent movements, Sarah struggled through knee-deep snow toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards from their shelter. The wind was so strong she could barely stay upright, and the cold was already numbing her exposed face. Then, she heard it. A faint sound that was definitely not the wind. Snow heard it too, becoming even more agitated inside her jacket. Someone was calling for help. "Hello?" Sarah shouted into the storm, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Is someone there?" The response was weak but unmistakable. "Help! Please! Over here!" Sarah fought her way toward the voice, following Snow's continued guidance. The ferret seemed to have an exact fix on the location, directing her through hand signals and body movements that had become their private language over months of companionship. Behind a fallen tree, nearly buried in snow, Sarah found a figure in winter gear waving weakly at her. It was a woman, probably in her 30s, clearly in serious trouble. Her lips were blue with cold, and she was shivering uncontrollably. Thank God, the woman gasped. I thought I was going to die out here. Sarah helped the stranger to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they struggled back toward the cave. Snow remained alert inside her jacket, watching their surroundings for additional dangers. The ferret's rescue instincts were in full operation. My name's Jenny, the woman managed between chattering teeth. My car went off the road yesterday. I've been walking ever since, looking for shelter. Marcus was shocked when Sarah appeared at the cave entrance with an unexpected addition to their group. But he immediately helped get Jenny inside and began treating her for hypothermia. Their medical supplies were limited, but they managed to stabilize her condition with warm blankets and hot water melted from snow. Snow inspected the newcomer carefully, sniffing around her gear and checking her condition. The ferret seemed satisfied that Jenny posed no threat, but he remained watchful. His protective instincts extended to anyone Sarah chose to help. How did you find me? Jenny asked when she had warmed up enough to speak clearly. I thought I was completely lost. Sarah looked down at Snow, who was curled up near the cave entrance, keeping watch. We had help from our guide here. Snow heard you calling before we did. Jenny stared at the small white animal with amazement. That little ferret saved my life. I was starting to give up hope when I heard you shouting back. Over the next several hours, Jenny told them her story. She was a wildlife photographer who had been documenting the effects of climate change on Arctic animals. The sudden storm had caught her completely off guard while she was driving to a remote location. Her car had slid off the icy road and become stuck in a snowbank. I tried to dig it out, but the snow kept filling in faster than I could move it, she explained. When the storm got worse, I decided to leave the car and try to find shelter. Big mistake. I got turned around immediately. Sarah shared their own story of survival, emphasizing Snow's crucial role in keeping them alive. Jenny listened with growing amazement at the ferret's intelligence and loyalty. He's extraordinary, Jenny said, watching Snow maintain his vigilant watch at the cave entrance. I've photographed thousands of animals, but I've never seen behavior like this. As if understanding that he was being discussed, Snow looked back at them with his distinctive pink eyes. The ferret's gaze was alert and intelligent, almost human in its expressiveness. Sarah had always known Snow was special, but their survival situation had revealed depths to his character that she was still discovering. Their food situation was now critical. 3 people couldn't survive on the remaining supplies for more than another day. But the storm showed no signs of letting up, and venturing outside meant certain death in the extreme conditions. Snow seemed to understand their predicament. The ferret began making longer trips outside the cave, always returning after a few minutes but with increasing frequency. He was searching for something, though Sarah couldn't guess what. On his 5th trip of the day, Snow was gone longer than usual. Sarah began to worry that something had happened to him in the storm. The little ferret had never stayed away for more than a few minutes before. Where is he? She asked anxiously, watching the cave entrance. Maybe he found something, Marcus suggested. He's been acting like he's hunting for something specific. When Snow finally returned, he was not alone. Following behind him through the snow came a large dog, probably a Malamute or Husky mix. The dog was wearing a thick collar and appeared to be in good condition despite the storm. Where did he find a dog? Jenny asked in amazement. The dog carried something in its mouth. A thick canvas bag that had dropped at Sarah's feet before shaking the snow from its fur. Inside the bag were emergency food rations, medical supplies, and a radio beacon. Snow climbed onto Sarah's lap, clearly proud of his latest accomplishment. The ferret had somehow located a rescue dog and convinced it to bring supplies to their shelter. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was right in front of them. The dog must be from a search and rescue team, Marcus realized, examining the professional quality of the supplies. Someone's looking for us. Jenny activated the radio beacon, and immediately they heard voices responding. A rescue team had been searching for Jenny since her car was found abandoned. The storm had prevented aerial searches, but ground teams with specially trained dogs had been working to locate any survivors. We have 3 people in a cave shelter, Jenny spoke into the radio. GPS coordinates. She read off the numbers from the beacon's display. We're in stable condition but running low on food. The response was immediate and reassuring. A rescue team was only 2 miles away, following their search dog that had apparently detected human scents. They would reach the cave within a few hours. Snow sat in Sarah's lap, accepting praise and treats from their emergency food supply. The little ferret had not only found additional help but had somehow communicated their location to a rescue dog. His problem-solving abilities seemed to grow more remarkable with each challenge they faced. I don't understand how he did it, Sarah said, stroking Snow's white fur. It's like he knew exactly what we needed and went to find it. The rescue dog, whose name tag read Bear, had settled near the cave entrance alongside Snow. The 2 animals seemed to understand each other perfectly, despite their size difference. Bear occasionally looked down at Snow with what appeared to be respect for the little ferret's intelligence. As they waited for the rescue team to arrive, Sarah reflected on everything Snow had done to keep them alive. The ferret had warned them about the collapsing building, guided them to safety through the blizzard, found their shelter, detected Jenny's distress calls, and now had somehow summoned professional help. He's not just a pet, she realized aloud. Snow's been our leader through this whole ordeal. He's made every decision that mattered. Jenny nodded, watching the albino ferret with professional interest. I'd love to document his story. This kind of animal intelligence and loyalty needs to be recorded. Snow looked up at Sarah with those remarkable pink eyes, and she saw something in them that took her breath away. The ferret wasn't just smart or loyal. He was genuinely caring, making conscious choices to protect the humans he considered his family. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken. But, inside their cave, they had already been saved by the courage and intelligence of one small albino animal who refused to let his humans face danger alone. Snow had proven that heroes come in all sizes, and sometimes the smallest hearts contain the greatest courage. The rescue team arrived just as the storm finally began to lose its fury. Sarah heard the distant sound of snowmobiles approaching their shelter, guided by Bear's radio beacon and Snow's incredible ability to communicate their location. The little ferret sat alertly in her lap, listening to the approaching vehicles with satisfaction. They're here, Marcus said, relief evident in his voice as the engine sounds grew closer. Through the cave entrance, Sarah could see flashlight beams cutting through the diminishing snowfall. The rescue team consisted of 4 people in heavy winter gear, pulling sleds loaded with medical equipment and supplies. Bear bounded out to meet them, clearly excited to see his handlers. Anyone hurt in here? Called the team leader, a woman whose voice carried the authority of long experience with wilderness rescues. We're all stable, Sarah replied, helping Jenny to her feet. 1 case of mild hypothermia, but she's recovered. As the rescue team entered their small shelter, Snow remained calm but watchful. The ferret studied each new person carefully, his protective instincts still engaged even though danger had passed. Sarah could feel his small body tense whenever strangers moved too quickly near her. I'm Captain Rodriguez, the team leader said, immediately beginning medical assessments of all 3 survivors. We've been searching for Ms. Mitchell here since yesterday when her vehicle was found. Lucky thing our dog Bear picked up your scent trail. Jenny smiled weakly. Actually, it was this little guy who found your dog. She pointed to Snow, who was still perched on Sarah's shoulder. The ferret somehow led Bear back to us with supplies. Captain Rodriguez paused in her examination, looking at Snow with new interest. That's unusual. Our search dogs are trained to work independently. I've never heard of a wild animal actively cooperating with a rescue operation. Snow's not exactly wild, Sarah explained. I rescued him a few months ago, and he's been my companion at the research station. But his behavior during this storm has been extraordinary. One of the other rescue team members, a young man named Dave, was setting up a portable heater to warm the cave. What kind of research were you doing out here? He asked. Climate monitoring, Marcus replied. Studying weather patterns and their effects on local ecosystems. We got caught when this storm hit much harder than predicted. Sarah watched Snow carefully as the strangers worked around their shelter. The ferret remained alert but wasn't showing signs of distress. His trust in her seemed to extend to anyone she accepted as helpful. Still, he kept his pink eyes on each team member, ready to react if anyone posed a threat. "We need to get you all back to town," Captain Rodriguez said after completing her medical checks. "The storm's weakening, but there's another system moving in behind it. We have maybe a 4-hour window to travel safely." The rescue team efficiently packed their gear while Sarah gathered her few personal belongings. Snow supervised every movement, occasionally chittering softly when he disapproved of how someone handled equipment near his human companions. "He's very protective," Dave observed, watching Snow's behavior. "Acts more like a guard dog than a ferret." Sarah nodded, gently stroking Snow's white fur. "He's saved our lives multiple times in the past few days. I don't think we would have survived without him." Captain Rodriguez looked skeptical until Jenny began describing Snow's actions in detail. The ferret's early warning about the collapsing roof, his guidance through the blizzard to find the cave, his detection of Jenny's distress calls, and, finally, his apparent communication with the rescue dog. "That's remarkable," the captain admitted. "In 20 years of wilderness rescue, I've seen a lot of animal behavior, but nothing quite like that." As they prepared to leave the cave, Snow became increasingly agitated. The ferret ran to the entrance and back to Sarah several times, making urgent chittering sounds. His behavior reminded her of his earlier warnings about the roof collapse. "What's wrong with him now?" Marcus asked, noticing Snow's distress. Sarah picked up the ferret, feeling his rapid heartbeat against her hands. "He's trying to tell us something again." "Snow, what is it?" The little animal squirmed in her arms, pointing his nose toward the back of the cave. He wanted them to investigate something they had missed during their stay. Following Snow's guidance, Sarah used a flashlight to examine the rear wall of their shelter. Hidden behind a jutting rock formation, she discovered a narrow passage that led deeper into the hillside. "There's another chamber back here," she called to the others. Snow found something. Captain Rodriguez joined her investigation, shining her more powerful light into the hidden passage. What they found made everyone stare in amazement. The passage opened into a larger cave that had clearly been used as a shelter before. The hidden chamber contained survival supplies, blankets, dried food, and even a small wood-burning stove with a chimney that led to the surface. Someone had prepared this location as an emergency refuge, stocking it with everything needed for long-term survival. "This is incredible," Captain Rodriguez said, examining the supplies. "Someone put a lot of work into creating this shelter." An old journal wrapped in waterproof material lay on a natural shelf in the rock wall. Jenny carefully opened it and began reading the faded handwriting inside. "It's dated 15 years ago," she said. "Written by someone named Robert Chen who got stranded here during a research expedition. He survived for 3 weeks in this cave and decided to leave supplies for future emergencies." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Chen? That's my father's name. He disappeared during a research trip when I was in college. They never found his body." The journal contained detailed descriptions of survival techniques and observations about local wildlife. On the last page, Robert Chen had written a message for anyone who might find his refuge in the future. "If you're reading this, you've survived something terrible and found the safety I tried to create here. I hope these supplies help save your life. Remember that sometimes the smallest creatures can teach us the most about survival and loyalty. Trust in the animals that choose to help you. They often know things we don't." Sarah read the words with tears in her eyes. Her father had survived his ordeal long enough to create this shelter, this lifeline for future travelers caught in similar disasters. And, somehow, Snow had known about it all along. How did Snow know about this chamber, she wondered aloud. Captain Rodriguez had been thinking about the same question. "Maybe your ferret has been here before. If this cave system provided shelter for animals during storms, he might have explored it during his time in the wild." Sarah looked down at Snow, who was now calm and satisfied in her arms. The ferret had guided them to the exact shelter her father had prepared years ago. Whether by coincidence or something more mysterious, Snow had brought her to a place where she could feel connected to the father she had lost. "We should update our records," Captain Rodriguez said. "This shelter could save lives in future emergencies. Your father created something important here." As they finally left the cave system, Sarah carried Snow in her arms, grateful for everything the little animal had done. The ferret had not only saved their lives but had somehow led her to discover her father's final gift to future travelers. The trip back to town took 2 hours on the rescue snowmobiles. Snow rode inside Sarah's jacket, occasionally poking his head out to check their surroundings. Even during the rescue, he maintained his protective vigilance. At the medical facility in town, Snow refused to leave Sarah's side during her checkup. The veterinarian who examined him pronounced the ferret to be in excellent health, remarkable considering what he had endured during the storm. "He's obviously bonded very strongly with you," the vet explained. "This level of protective behavior is unusual for ferrets, but not unheard of. You've got yourself a very special companion." Jenny kept her promise to document Snow's story. Her article about the remarkable albino ferret who saved 3 lives during an Arctic blizzard was published in several wildlife magazines. The story brought Snow national attention and highlighted the intelligence and loyalty that animals can display in crisis situations. Sarah returned to her research work, but with a new understanding of the partnership between humans and animals. Snow accompanied her on every field trip, serving as both companion and early warning system for dangerous conditions. The little ferret never again displayed the extreme behaviors that had saved them during the storm. It was as if he understood that his heroic actions were needed only during that specific crisis. But he remained alert and protective, always ready to help his human family face whatever challenges they might encounter. Snow had proven that love and loyalty know no boundaries of size or species. The albino ferret who refused to leave his human behind had become a symbol of the extraordinary bonds that can form between people and the animals who choose to share their lives. In the end, Snow's greatest gift wasn't just saving their lives during the storm. He had shown Sarah that her father's legacy of caring for others lived on, connecting past and present through the simple act of creatures helping each other survive. The little white ferret had brought healing to wounds she didn't even know still hurt, proving that sometimes salvation comes in the smallest and most unexpected packages.